This is On the Line, and I'm Eric Felton. Development isn't just about economic gains, but about preventing millions of infant deaths from pneumonia and diarrhea, feeding the hundreds of millions of people who don't have enough food, providing reliable electricity for everyone. A new book, Getting to Scale, looks at the biggest challenges in development, how to make improvements on a large enough scale to affect whole societies. What are the challenges and opportunities in trying to reach scale? I'll ask my guest. Laurence Chandy, a fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., and co-editor of the new book, Getting to Scale, How to Bring Development Solutions to Millions of Poor People. Welcome. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So what is this concept of scale, and how do you look at a project differently in terms of it being something you're trying to do on a large scale versus a small scale?
Well, I'd start by saying that any intervention attempted in the developing world, whether it's by an aid agency, by a charity, by a private corporation, usually starts at a very small level. You might try with a pilot, you might try with an individual community, and if that works, the next thing to think about is how can I replicate this? How can I expand it to reach more people? And when we talk about scale in the book, we don't provide a precise definition of a certain number of people who have been helped, but we're talking here about transformational change, reaching, if possible, thousands, if not millions of people. So we're talking about trying to affect those, move those indicators you talked about in the opening segment. The number of people in a country who don't have access to power or who are dying from preventable deaths. If the interventions aren't able to affect those indicators, then they're not really operating at scale.
Now, are there programs that when you try them on a small scale, they work well, but because of just the nature of the project, once you try to do it at a larger scale, you find they don't work so well?
I think that's exactly right. There is a huge range in the success of development interventions. There are some which are real disasters, which you unfortunately hear about a lot more in the press than the ones which work well. But of the ones that work well, some of them are what we like to call kind of gold-plated or sort of boutique interventions, which work well because of their small size, by virtue of it. And they're not capable of being brought to scale because they just wouldn't work at that larger scale. Perhaps they wouldn't be affordable. Perhaps they involve far too many people doing far too many complex activities. So when we think about this objective of scale, this abstract idea of how can I scale something up, it has to be something which is viable at a large level. And so what that leads us to think about the business model, by which I mean the combination of the product, the pricing, the payment, the overall package of what it is we're which is being provided to people, and whether that can work, as I say, at that very large level.
Now, with a development project, the larger, at least if the development project involves donations and money's being put into something, right, you scale it up and you have to ratchet up the amount of money being poured into it. When a business grows, if it's making money off of something, the growing the business means they're making more money rather than losing more money. How do you try to deal with that in a development sense, not just running out of money when you grow something larger?
So here you're referring to a distinction we make in the book, which is how people tend to think about scale. They think about what we call subsidized models, which rely on those donations, some philanthropic component, in order to continue to grow. And then we have these market-based commercial opportunities, which are able to grow by virtue of market forces. And I think the problem you talk about is that any subsidized model is ultimately limited by how many subsidies can be afforded. What donors tend to do, this is official donors such as the US Agency for International Development, is once they have an intervention which they think is very good, they'll look to pass it on to the government in the country in which they're working. They'll suggest that perhaps the government co-finances the project and maybe eventually takes it on themselves so it can be forwarded through tax revenues. But there's still this question of, even then, can it be afforded? If the revenue collection is relatively low in the country, if there are lots of other things the government's trying to do, however good the project is, the recipient government might just say, we can't afford to take this on and roll it out throughout the country. So that constraint of finance is one of the most serious constraints to scale.
And in the book, you look at a bunch of examples, among them cell phone finance programs in Kenya that mix the sort of development aid model and leverage the power of a market-based business model as well.
So this is a really fascinating case study, and one which people talk about a lot in the development world. The story started in around 2007 when Safaricom, which is a mobile phone operator in Kenya, built this service called mobile money. In Kenya it's called M-Pesa, allowing people to transfer money through their mobile phones. This meant that I could send money to a relative who lives in the Highlands, or I could pay a utility bill just through pressing some buttons on my phone. Very low transaction costs, very easy to do. And this offering was incredibly successful. Within as little as 3 years, almost all adults in Kenya were banked. They were using this financial product. This is in a country where where around 2/3 of people live below $2 a day, and typically don't have access to formal financial services. What you mentioned was that there was a catalyst which helped get this intervention off the ground, and that was that there was a little bit of soft money provided by the UK aid agency DFID to help Safaricom develop the product in the first place. There are other facilitating factors too. Such as the role of regulators in Kenya. I actually think the business model was really uniquely suited to the Kenyan market. But there's no doubt that that initial subsidy, if you like, the initial bit of grant money helped to get the ball rolling. And without that, it's not clear whether the product would now exist.
Are there any lessons from that example or other examples that you look at in the book that suggest what kinds of projects are more likely to be able to happen on a large enough scale to make a big difference in the lives of societies rather than perhaps just individual communities?
Well, I think there are lots of factors, and I think it's we really wanted to find that silver bullet which we could put in the conclusion of the book, and we couldn't find one because it's a very complex process trying to move to scale. There are lots of necessary ingredients to make that transition. There are all kinds of aspects such as leadership and a long-term vision. They've got human aspects which we think are important. But then again, I return to this idea of the business model. Is there a good are there good financial arrangements which would allow this thing to work, to move to scale? Is there the delivery model in place so that you're able to reach large numbers of people? Are there good enough internal systems within the organization providing this particular service to allow it to move to scale without incurring all kinds of problems? So there are various, I wouldn't identify a single thing, but we start in the book to identify some things which we think are particularly crucial, and I think that it boils down mostly to this problem of finance and delivery. They, I think, are the two key challenges. Any successful scale-up intervention has managed to nail an effective approach to finance and to delivery.
And do those go together, or do they work at cross purposes?
Well, I think that they can actually be separated in many cases. I think one of the problems which some people have found, some organizations have found when they've tried to transition to scale, is they try and do everything themselves. And if you can pull apart, if you can prize apart these two aspects, then that lends itself to working in partnership with others. If we go back to that example of M-Pesa, the Safaricom, the mobile operator, runs the service, but it relies on agents throughout the country to serve as tellers. To allow people to put some money into their account. And those agents are not, they are all formal employees of the company, but they actually serve many other roles as well. They are gas stations, they're retailers, they are courier services. So it's this ability to, I think, prize apart the two, which means that no one organization has to be able to master every aspect of scaling up themselves. And with such a complex process of scaling up, you almost inevitably have to start to work in partnership. You can't work alone. It's just too much for one actor to take on itself.
Laurence Chandy of the Brookings Institution is co-editor of the new book, Getting to Scale: How to Bring Development Solutions to Millions of Poor People. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.